he wasn't what he claimed to be, but he was like a nice guy who told you to be nice to people and stuff like that. That is an insane view of Jesus from the point of view of Judaism.
Hello and welcome to this interview. I'm doing this one, Beau, and today, hopefully with a conversation all about early Christianity, I am joined by Mr. Stephen Carson, otherwise known as Radical Liberation. Radlib, how are you, sir?
Very good.
Good.
Yeah, sometimes I go by my name, sometimes I go by Radical Liberation as a marketing tool, because that's my channel on YouTube. So.
Right. We do like to talk to people by their real name. It's a bit more personal, and we are. So as long as you're okay with that.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'd like to say straight off the bat, my sort of background is ancient history, sort of up to late antiquity, even the early Christian period a bit. But I will bow to your superior knowledge. I listened to you do a speech, a presentation about this sort of thing, and I just thought it was superb. And so I'd like to, if possible, pick your brain a little bit about it and see where we go.
All right.
Okay, well then, one of the angles that you did in the lecture, presentation, speech I saw you do was just about how this very interesting idea, I think very interesting, how Christianity went from nothing in the age of Augustus, Tiberius, to sort of all dominant by the age of Constantine, or certainly by the age of Theodosius the First, perhaps you could say.
Right. We would say that by the time of Constantine, it was such a presence that the Roman Empire gave up trying to get rid of it. Right. Because for a couple hundred years there had been the occasional persecution. Hey, we'll knock this thing out. With the Edict of Toleration, Edict of Milan, right, 313, they're throwing their hands up in the air. That's sort of how I see it. And they're saying, we got to get along with these people or contain them or something, Right. We're not going to destroy this anymore. We've got to get along with it.
Right, yeah, but of course, absolutely. But of course, then you've got sort of the figure of Julian the Apostate, for example, in the 360s, who gave it a good crack, didn't he?
One more try. Yeah.
But as I understand it, if we talk about the 390s of Theodosius, where it seems to me at that point it was just there was no way back. There was no snuffing it out, really, by that point. But well, maybe if we could just talk about Constantine, the first Constantine the Great, a bit to begin with, even though we sort of. It's towards the end of the process by that point, isn't it, already? Right. Sort of in the end game. But I wonder what your thoughts are, be as general or as specific as you like, about Constantine, how he was sort of, if you like, captured. Is that the right way to put it, by the Christian ideologies? Because I've seen different historians sort of say different things about this, whether it was sort of out of the blue and a great coup, if for want of a better word, for the Christians that Constantine the Great converted, or whether you think it was sort of something approaching inevitable by that point or not. What are your feelings about that?
Right. So I would say inevitable, and I'd say there's a major piece of evidence for this, which is that the Edict of Toleration is not new. And I'm sorry, I don't have the details to hand, but just a couple of years before, right, at this point, Constantine is a co-emperor. I don't know if you'd remember there were like four emperors.
The Tetrarchy, yes, of course.
Yeah, right. They kept warring until there was just Constantine. But anyway, so at some point in this process, before 313, already they had made it like an Edict of Toleration a couple years before. So this is a process that's happening of the Roman Empire reconciling itself to the reality that Christianity is here to stay, basically, right? Right. And then with Julian, as you mentioned, they kind of try one more time. But overall, I think this is a process. And so my take here is that putting too much emphasis on Constantine as his personal experience is not really the way to think about it. And remember, don't misunderstand what this Edict of Toleration was. It's an Edict of Toleration, right? It's not, hey, the Christians are in charge now. It's, okay, we're going to have to stop persecuting them now. And pagans and Christians are going to have to get along, right? So I think sometimes people misunderstand and think that Constantine became a Christian. He like imposed Christianity on everyone. That's, as far as I know, not what happened. It was again, in my view, Christianity's here to stay. We're going to have to get along with them. We can't keep on persecuting them like we've been doing. We've got to figure out how to get them to pull. We've got to play along with them in some way, or we're going to have real problems. What's it called? The political formula, Moscow's political formula, right? It's just not sustainable to say that, the Roman Empire is 100% pagan and we can just ignore the Christians. This is just not sustainable because there's just too many Christians. And as we'll get into, the Christians are in high places. Right. They're elites, which we'll explain. Right?
It's interesting, the word toleration. It's usually used sort of in the wrong way sometimes in our era, but in the true sense, you tolerate something you actually don't like, don't you? Usually, you sort of tolerate something that you would rather didn't exist. So exactly. It is really interesting. Yeah. I suppose by the age of
the edict of putting up with.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right? Yeah. But then also you've got sort of, I suppose, famously in the age of Constantine is the first Council of Nicaea. I mean, surely that's a big thing. It must loom large in your view of things. No, the way that certain theological debates were settled, or they tried to settle certain things during the first Council of Nicaea, which is again right towards the end of the 320s. So it's like towards the end of Constantine's reign. But by that point, you can already see there's sort of big churches all around the Mediterranean. By that point, it's already quite an established sort of a big phenomenon already by the mid 320s to 330s sort of time.
Right, and bear in mind, I kind of come at this from I'm on the Christian side, right? So I'm thinking about it from that point of view. So to me, one of the most striking things about the Council of Nicaea is that it's called by the emperor. Right. It's invoked by Emperor Constantine. Well, this is quite a new thing, right? Because not only had they been persecuting the church, or they had been persecuting the church, so it would be unthinkable for a Roman official to call a theological gathering, right? That makes no sense. And now here we have the emperor acting in a church governance role. Yeah, you might say. Yeah, right. Yeah. Now, it only consists, as far as I can tell, of saying, "Hey, bishops, get together and sort this thing out. Settle this thing." Because I want less controversy. I want to settle some controversies and just kind of let's decide what Christianity is and run with it, right? In other words, he is now interested in the church sort of being peaceable, and so at this point you start what Christians often think of as the Constantinian era, which we are just exiting, and that is this long period where the Western states, or Western governments, and the church get intermingled. Whereas prior to this, there's no intermingling. There's just the secular authority is against Christianity, right? Well, now it's complicated, right? Yeah, and was for 1,500 years or whatever, right?
I find it fascinating in the First Council of Nicaea that obviously Constantine himself calls it, and then it seems that they defer to him as well at some point when they can't really. He becomes sort of the final judge, the final arbiter when they can't decide amongst themselves. And what a strange mixture of religious and secular that is. I mean, it's sort of very odd to our world. We're used to people like a patriarch or a pope being very, very, very deliberately and explicitly separate to a chancellor or a prime minister or a president. But in those days, the lines are blurred. It's interesting to me. Well, very interesting.
Henry VIII comes to mind.
Right. Okay.
So it's not just back then.
Right. I wonder if we could go back a bit then and then work back up to the age of Constantine and maybe talk a bit about Julian the Apostate and Theodosius and things. But I would like to pick your brain a bit, if possible, about the very, very, very early Christians, perhaps in the age of Nero. So I'm thinking you've got the days of Jesus of Nazareth himself. And then you've got
Right.
a sort of, I suppose, the letters of Paul are probably some of the earliest things we've got, who of course was contemporaneous. And then the earliest Gospels, which are after when the temple was sacked by Titus in sort of 70 AD.
70, yeah.
And then we've got sort of, but I want to ask about Nero, because he of course is sort of fairly famous for persecuting. He blamed the Great Fire of Rome on the Christians, didn't he? And burnt a lot of them, made human torches of them. And so it's interesting to see, I think, how you go from that sort of fairly undeniably a very, very low ebb for Christians at the age of Nero, how we can go from that period to the next, 100, 150 odd years, where there are blips, but it goes from strength to strength to strength.
Yeah.
Could you tell me a bit about that, or your feelings?
So just to restate a little bit of what you're saying, we do see the occasional persecution. There's local ones, and then there's general persecutions. Those are the ones we probably know about the most, right? They're written about the most. That is where the policy of the Roman Empire for a time becomes stop this Christian thing, right? But whether, as far as we can tell, whether persecutions are going on or not, Christianity just continues to grow. One reason we know this is it has to keep on a growth cycle, sort of mathematically, to get to the point where it can be what it is in the 300s,
right? Where
some people estimate that by, say, 350 AD, a majority of people in the Roman Empire were Christians. Certainly that's something in that neighborhood is plausible, right? Well, you don't get to that. I mean, there are not as many people as these days, right? But there are a lot of people in the Roman Empire. You don't get to that without steady growth, steady, that growth curve going up throughout those couple hundred years, right? Yeah, that I hadn't thought so much about Nero. That is pretty bizarre because, let's see, he's 54 to 68. This is really, really early for Christianity. There's not that many Christians. So it's kind of strange that he picks on them. It's kind of strange he even knows they exist. Right. Because there might be at that point in the thousands. I mean, this is 0.001%, or, this is some super small percentage of the people in the Roman Empire. They're not a force to be reckoned with at all in mid-first century. They could be ignored. Why does it? I don't know. Maybe you have more insight on Nero. I don't understand why he would pick out, I'm sure from his point of view, one of many various religious groups in the empire and cults and so forth, right? And he picks this one out and decides to, blame the fire in Rome on it. I don't get it. I have to say, it does. Or let me put it this way: I don't see it as politically strategic. Like, oh, okay, Christians are really a political threat, and I've really got to use this as an excuse to go after them. They're not a political threat in the mid-first century. That's absurd. I mean, it's literally just, it's like he spun a wheel and it landed on Christians and decided, let's blame them, I guess. Why not? So anyway, that is truly bizarre. Whereas as Christianity continues to grow in these couple centuries, it seems less surprising to me that they start to try to move against it. Right. Yeah. Because it is, you get to the second century and it is something. It isn't just one religious cult among many, it's starting to be something that is sticking out a little bit more and maybe becomes of interest to the secular authorities, like they start to see it as competition in some way. Yeah. So anyway, the Nero persecution is just strange to me. Do you have any thoughts on it? I don't get it. Why?
Well, I feel like in sort of classical Rome, they're relatively tolerant to different sects and cults and all sorts of things. As long as you paid lip service to the cult of the emperor, the imperial cult, and you weren't too insane, if you didn't sort of advocate, mass murder or mass rape or mass castration or anything like that, and then you were sort of allowed to do what you want within reason. And a lot of the historians, Gibbon, for example, talks a lot about but the Romans did have a problem with sort of strictly monotheistic religions like Judaism, for example, real problems with Judaism because they just refused to accept the cult of the emperor, for example. And I think Christians were in that same mold. And
Right.
so, but you're quite right. It's very, very, very early on in the Christian story, the reign of Nero. It's almost surprising that they're in Rome. Even you might be forgiven for thinking that it's still a cult that's just in Judea. Well, that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about.
I was going to say, I think that's a good segue. Go ahead.
Just about the difference between sects and cults, because I heard you talk about that, and I thought your thoughts on that were very, very interesting.
Right, and then let's come back to how is it that Christians are in Rome at all? At the time of Nero, we're talking at the most 30, less than 40 years after Christ. Right. That is very early in the story, right? What in the heck are they doing in Rome at all? And certainly enough for Nero to notice them and decide to make an example of them. Okay, so sect and cult. All right. So this is my talk. It's fun that you're having me on a history podcast because my talk was really sociology of religion, as you might have noticed. It was right because you might recall I talked about the Moonies, and I don't know that I mentioned them, but the Mormons also loom large because they're a modern cult that is growing probably in a way that's similar to what the early church was growing. Their growth is actually quite consistent. And they're pretty big at this point and getting bigger. So anyway, sect versus cult. So a sect is a movement within an established religion, maybe like a splinter movement. And typically, to use sociology of religion terminology, it is trying to increase tension. That is, you want to have like fundamentalism, like Islamic fundamentalism or something like that. You want to make it clear that you're not just like going along with the world. You're something different. You have a spiritual mission. It separates you. It creates tension from the culture, right? And an established religion starts to get too comfortable, too, fitting in too nicely with everything. And so a sect would be in the Greco-Roman paganism that dominates at this time. A sect would have been like, hey, we need to return to the gods. We have forgotten Zeus. We need to get back to the temple and we need to really pay him honor. You guys are treating the gods disrespectfully. You're not giving them their due. We need to be like fundamentalist pagans, right? I don't know that there was ever such movements, but that would be a sect. So it'd be just like a sect of paganism. Paganism is the reigning paradigm, and this is just sort of a little bit of a tweak within the reigning paradigm. Okay, a cult, on the other hand, is a new religion, or you could say a new paradigm, a new culture, a new set of ideas. And certainly Judaism and Christianity, with their monotheism and exclusivity, I'll talk about that more in a minute, exclusivity are cults within the context of Greco-Roman paganism. They are not a call back to be more faithful to Zeus and Aphrodite or something like that. They're saying this is completely new. To embrace Judaism, and we'll need to mention in a moment, some of the Greco-Romans did, by the way. To embrace Judaism, to embrace Christianity, is to walk away from the established religion and go into something completely new. So technically that's what we mean by a cult in this context. We don't mean that it's weird or something, the modern ear hears cult and that just means, that's when you act strangely or something. No, that's not what we mean. It just means it's a new religion relative to the culture that you're in. Right.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting because, of course, as you say there, I was going to mention it that obviously in our era, the word cult has got really negative connotations. You just think of sort of people that are waiting for a spaceship to come down, mass suicide, silliness, that sort of thing. But the word's got actual. Well, when I listened to your speech talking about sects and cults, I did a bit of reading after that because I did find it fascinating. And one person, I can't remember who, but one historian I was reading, I wonder what you think of this idea, that they said that sort of the ministry of Jesus whilst he was alive, you could argue it was a sect of Judaism, But after the resurrection, or perhaps more accurately, after the first Gospels, Mark, speak of the resurrection, at that point it becomes a cult. And I mean a cult, not occult. Again, let's be clear on that. Yeah. Would you agree with that sort of definition? Does that sort of ring true to you?
Right, exactly.
Because it becomes a new religion once you accept, if you accept the resurrection. Right,
exactly. So you know, when you read Jesus's words, to some degree, you could take it as a sect. That is, you know, you guys have made the law like ridiculous and burdensome. You know, the Mosaic law. You've made it too hard for people, and you've forgotten what really matters. You know, really your heart being for God. You know, loving your neighbor. You know, you need to go to the fundamentals of what all this is really about. You're caught up in sort of pointless details, right? He talks about you tithe on your herbs, your mint, and you know you tithe down to little details, you know, but you forget what really matters, what the point of all this really is, you know, to serve God, to love your neighbor, and so forth, right? So you could see it as sort of a let's be more fundamentalist about our Judaism, right? Let's get back to what this is really all about, as you read Jesus, right? And some Jews, I think, saw it that way as at the time. It's hey, this guy's calling us back to really serving the God of Israel in a deeper way than what our religious rulers are.
Yeah.
But after the resurrection, it is a cult within the empire, as we talked about, within the context of paganism, but also, as you say, within Judaism. And the Jews, part of our evidence for seeing something as a cult is how it gets treated, right? A cult is viewed as a threat to the established religion, whereas a sect, people might feel it's annoying, kind of like, you know, boy, these guys are really taking paganism super seriously. You know, it's like, you know, I just want to live my life. You know, do I have to go to the temple again today? You know, right? That would be how people respond to a sect. It may be annoying. It'd see it as annoying, right? At the most. But a cult is viewed as a real threat, a true competitor to the established religion. Right. And that is certainly how the Jewish authorities treat Jesus, but then also the apostles and so forth, right? They are looking to stamp this thing out. They execute people when they can get away with it. The Roman Empire doesn't allow them technically to execute, but they either do it through the Romans or they kind of just sneakily stone someone and say, oh, the mob, what could we do, you know, right? But the point is, they are viewing the early Christians as a competitor to the religious authorities in Jerusalem, right. You know, the established authorities of Judaism.
Yeah. I once heard a Christian detractor, well, it was Christopher Hitchens. I once heard him describe Christ as something like a rogue rabbi. I mean, what do you think of that? I've always really wanted to ask someone who really knows their onions about early Christianity what they think of that, whether that's really far off the mark or actually, you know, accurate. What do you think? An apocalyptic rogue rabbi.
Right. So I think actually C.S. Lewis gave us the best way of thinking about this, where he said that sort of view is absurd. And also he would put into that bucket of absurd views of Jesus that he was just sort of, you know, he wasn't what he claimed to be, but he was like a nice guy who told you to be nice to people and stuff like that. That is an insane view of Jesus from the point of view of Judaism, because Jesus clearly claims to be God. And in Judaism, well, he's either right or he is nuts.
Right. Yeah.
You know, he's a heretic. He's or an insane person or something. You know, like somebody who says they're Napoleon or something like that. Right. He's like a loony. Yeah. He absolutely says he's God, and anyone who's steeped in the Old Testament can't miss it, because he says things like, "Before Abraham was, I am." What does "I am" mean? When God talks to Moses and tells him that he's going to have him get the Jews out of Egypt, the Exodus and all that. And Moses says, "Who should I call? What should I call you? What's your name? How do I refer to you?" And the Lord responds, "I am who I am."
Yeah.
So when Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, not only is he saying, I was around back then, which is a big clue, but he's saying, I am. He's using the name of God and he's applying it to himself. Mm-hmm. And the Jews completely get that. If you read the scriptures where Jesus says that, they immediately are like, let's stone this guy.
Right. Gosh,
right?
I suppose to their mind. I was just going to say. So to their mind, he's claiming to be the Messiah, if you like, but to their mind, it's a false prophet and like a heinous crime to do that.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. He's not just having sort of some oddly strict teachings about traditional Judaism or something. He's doing something new, and they're more than suspicious of it. Right.
Yeah.
They think there's something wrong with this guy.
Right. Okay. No, absolutely. I suppose we'd have to move on a bit because our time is a little bit limited. Probably about an hour, maybe a touch more. And there's so many things I'd love to ask you about and pick your brain about. But,
the sect versus cult thing. Yeah, I wanted to make sure to use that opportunity to talk about the different natures of the sect and the cult, because that's going to help us understand why the Roman Empire has the attitude it ends up having later to the Christians. A sect, sociologists point out to us, tends to draw from the lower classes. Right. Okay. That is, this is an established religion, and we just need to get more serious about it. And this is something that sort of the lesser educated can understand, right? And so, to some degree, think of the caricature that you get of the rural Christian in America, right? Who's, from the point of view of the liberal elites in the city, is simple and is into snake handling or something like that, right? Yeah. So that's a sect. It's drawing from the lower classes, the less educated. A cult, though, can't really work that way, because a cult is introducing new ideas. It's a paradigm shift. It's something that we find to this day draws from the educated or the elite, you could say, of society. Maybe not the top people, like the emperor didn't necessarily become a Christian for a couple hundred years, right? Mm-hmm. But it says that there were people we know that there were people in the emperor's household who were Christians quite early on. Right. So it's drawing from the elite, because they're the ones who are able to notice that there's something missing about the reigning paradigm, and feel like we need some different answers. And so one of the things you read about, even in the scriptures, are God-fearers. These are Gentiles, non-Jews, who are drawn to the monotheism of Judaism. And what's quite clear, even in the New Testament, is that not only is Christianity following Jewish networks through the empire, and some Jewish people are becoming Christians, right? Like Paul, like the apostles, etc. But these God-fearers are some of the first to really stampede into Christianity. That is, these are Gentiles who were already feeling drawn to something, the monotheism of Judaism, and were seeing the Jewish teachers as people to really listen to. So they already were early adopters of doing something besides Greco-Roman paganism here. And then Christianity comes along, and as you might remember, Paul has this big emphasis on how you don't have to be circumcised. Basically, you don't have to become a Jew to be a Christian. Mm-hmm. And now these God-fearers are like, oh, okay, I can have the monotheism that was drawing me and feels like sort of a better answer than Greco-Roman paganism, but I can not have to become a Jew ethnically or whatever, what I mean? Yeah. Like become part of that people, right? I can still be a Greek or a Roman, but also be a Christian at the same time. Right. So Christianity really offers them a great deal, you might say. And so the God-fearers, after a century or two, are not talked about anymore, because they've become Christians.
Right, that's interesting. It puts me in mind of a silly little thing, but a joke in The Simpsons where Ned Flanders said he eats kosher food just to be safe, just to cover all the bases.
Right.
I think that's really quite funny to me. Well, I wonder if I could ask you about then, as you say, in those very, very early days, the first century or so after Christ, into the 2nd century AD, of where there's this, I find absolutely fascinating, mixture and crossover between other things like Mithraism or the cult of the Sibylline, or I think
ISIS.
Yes,
the cult of ISIS,
right? Yeah, and even I think even the cult of Apollo. There's some sort of crossover there with sort of being the son of God, or son connotations, things like this. I think Constantine the Great was very, very interested in. Well, he was a devotee of Apollo before he sort of converted, and there's something there. Mithraism and Mithra always seem to get mentioned in the literature. What are your thoughts and feelings about that?
Right. So okay. So how does a cult succeed? Right. So, like I said, cults have to draw on the elites. But then why would the elites move to something besides the established religion? Most of the time they don't. Right. Empires go on for a long time, Babylonians or whatever, right? They go on for a long time with their gods and their sort of established understanding of the world, their theology, however you want to think about it, right? Their religion. That is more normal for the elites to uphold the established religion. So when you see a cult, like it eventually does in the Roman Empire, it means that the elites are dissatisfied with the current deal, right? The current religion. And so I think that's the right way to understand Mithraism and the cult of Isis and so on and so forth. It's that they are looking for something because they are not feeling like what they've inherited is working. And I illustrated that, just to be dramatic and to be kind of relevant, I illustrated that in my talk by focusing on how the plagues were handled, right? And so what we see in the plagues is that the pagans run for the hills and die in great numbers because no one will care for the sick. They just run away from them and they throw them out in the street, right? Whereas the Christians do care for the sick. And so Christians actually survive in greater numbers than pagans when there's these big plagues, in the plague of Galen, for example, in 165, I think. So that is, so to put it bluntly here, paganism is not giving a practical way to handle some of the crises that are going on in the Roman Empire at this time.
Right.
And Christians start to have better responses. Like, just ignore how Christians are thinking about it for a moment. And let's just say that the actions of Christians are having better results. Okay.
Yeah.
And so this is, for someone who's paying attention, for an elite and a thoughtful, educated person, someone who knows sort of what's going on in the empire and everything, this is going to start to cause dissatisfaction. It's like, okay, our established way of doing things isn't working very well when it comes to a crisis like, say, a plague. And there were other crises. And these weird Jewish thing, whatever this thing is, this weird esoteric Jewish thing, it's doing better in the face of a crisis. So that's going to make you, if you notice that, that's going to make you feel dissatisfied. And now that might not make you a Christian right away, right? It might make you go, okay, I see. So we need to do something different. How about Mithraism? Right? So that dissatisfaction might take different forms. Now, over time, as we know, Christianity wins. But the thing to pay attention to prior to that, the period you're talking about, say 2nd century, the thing that we see is that there's dissatisfaction and they're looking for other things. And thus, Mithraism, cult of Isis, etc., are other options that are pretty different, I guess, from traditional Greco-Roman paganism. Different enough that it looks like, okay, well, maybe this will work. Maybe this will let us handle some of these problems in a better way, right?
Like the mystery cults, various mystery cults, and things. I mean, it's really interesting. I think it's a human trait across all time and cultures, or nearly all times and cultures, is looking for answers for things, our sort of insatiable human need to try and find answers for things. And when you're confronted in the real world, in real life, in your lifetime, you're confronted with something that is sort of mind-bogglingly terrifying, and there's no real answers for it, like a plague. So you called it the plague of Galen, or sometimes it's the Antonine plague, which we don't think is an actual plague. It might have been sort of smallpox or measles or something. But anyway, the point is, it swept off something like 20-25% of all people. I mean, a terrifying pandemic.
Horrifying.
Yeah, quite literally horrifying. And in lieu of having any idea of what it is and why, or what you can do to battle against it, if you can find any kind of solace or answer anywhere, then that's going to be appealing, isn't it? And as you say, sort of the classical Roman paganism, sort of the people that are devotees of Saturn or Jupiter or something, it doesn't offer you anything, does it? It's just the gods are capricious and they're going to do what they're going to do, and you're at their whim, and that's it. That's the end of the story. So it does make sense, absolutely, doesn't it, that in the 1st, 2nd century AD, the age of sort of Marcus Aurelius, that it would be appealing to people that don't know any better, have got nothing else to draw upon.
Right. Yeah. So I focused on the actions, that the actions of the early Christians were more efficacious. They actually helped. People started to notice that Christians survived plagues better than pagans, right? But you're bringing up something else, which totally is the other side of the coin, right? The other thing that needs to be emphasized, which is that it isn't only that we want to have, utilitarian action. I mean, that is, you'd rather survive than not survive. You'd rather your family survive the plague than not survive. So that's pretty appealing, right? But as you say, that's not really enough for humans, simply to be utilitarian. It also has to kind of be satisfying, metaphysically satisfying, right? And so, yes, they're metaphysically unsatisfied, you might say. That's what we're seeing in the Roman Empire. They're unsatisfied, and it's having lots of results, as I emphasized in my talk. They're not having children. They're not reproducing. They actually fall below replacement rate. Under Julius, the pagans do. Pagans fall under replacement rate under Julius Caesar, under Caesar, prior to Christ. And he's one of the earliest who passes a law that you will get various benefits if you have 3 children. That is, the Roman Empire recognizes they've got a problem, that people are not reproducing in the empire, and actually tries to take action to do something about it. I'll just give away the spoiler here. It doesn't work, and the Roman Empire continues throughout this period to have a problem with its population reproducing. So, to me, that is, like it is these days, that is a real cry for help, you could say. When a people stops reproducing itself, that tells you something, right? There's a lack of vitality going on there, right? When people are vital, the Spinglerian, the age of vitality, right? When people are vital, they have children, they reproduce, they're hopeful about life, right? And when they lack that, they just stop having children, not having very many, right?
Yeah, it speaks.
So it's like they're petering out, Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It speaks of some sort of something vapid, something terribly hollow at the heart of your cultural civilization. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it's really worrying. Very, very worrying.
It makes me feel sad. I'm feeling sad for the Romans. I mean, what did it feel like for them? That they didn't even want to bother to have children.
Yeah, or the future seems sort of profoundly hopeless. That it would be a cruel thing to have children, to condemn them to the near future that's going to be horrible.
You hear people say that right now. How could I bring a child into this world? Have you ever heard that phrase? Yeah. People say that today. I mean, what a profoundly sad thing for someone to say that. That speaks to a deep, like you're saying, a deep sort of spiritual emptiness. right?
Yeah. There's one parallel with we'll talk about the plague of Galen, or the Antonine Plague. Parallel with, perhaps, I wonder what you think of this, in the Black Death of the late 1340s, 1350 odd, where it seems, because I've read lots of accounts and things from that particular plague, which is a true plague, a bubonic pneumonic plague, where people sometimes, it affects people psychologically in all sorts of different ways, and some become a lot more pious, a lot more religious, and some it makes them completely abandon religiosity on every level. They feel as though they've been abandoned by their god or gods, and so why should I bother believing in it anymore? And I think it's really quite interesting the way it sort of makes extremes on both ends of the spectrum there. And I wonder if you've got any insights with the Antonine Plague, whether it did that, whether it was just simply a boon for Christians in the broadest sense, or whether there's sort of more to it than that. If there's more going on psychologically.
You're getting beyond my knowledge at this point. I because what we'd really want to look for there, right, is not only what I focused on, that is that Christianity, the ratio of pagan to Christian shifted in favor of the Christians after that plague, and then after another one in the 200s that was also quite terrible.
Plague, I think.
In each case, the ratio shifted in favor of the Christians. Now, in this plague of Galen, it's Antonine Plague. It's not that dramatic in terms of absolute numbers, because it's still pretty early days in terms of just the absolute numbers of Christians, right? But by the 3rd century plague, it's pretty significant, the shift in ratio of plagues. It's significant in both cases, but it's like getting more noticeable after that plague in the 300s, right? I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So what we'd want to look for is, did we see not only a shift in favor of the Christians after the plague? Pagans are more likely to become Christians. More Christians just literally survive because they take care of each other better than the pagans take care of each other. But also pagans become Christians more after these plagues. So there's an increase in converts, right? But one suspects, because of the dynamic we're talking about, just the search for answers, the effect of a crisis, that if I knew more about the ancient world, I would probably find that there's some other things going on in response to the plague, right? Some people may be trying to, get more serious about their paganism. Maybe other cults getting a foothold in the empire that had not been doing very well. Suddenly the plague comes along and people are getting into Mithraism. I don't know. That's now you're getting beyond my knowledge.
Okay.
The other things going on religiously at the time. So.
But you talked about their crisis just in general. It doesn't have to be sort of a health crisis like a plague. It could be also, because anyone that knows their sort of late antiquity will know of the crisis of the 3rd century. Historians love to talk about, which is a multifaceted thing. There's lots going on there, and we can't even really barely scratch the surface on it. But suffice to say that there's all sorts of things going on, and you could say that. Well, you talked about the Tetrarchy right at the beginning, so the age of Diocletian, where we just to briefly mention to people, there's the Emperor Diocletian, who realizes that I don't know if he's correct in realising it, but he thinks in his mind that the empire is just too big. And so we'll split it up into sort of the rule of 4. We'll have 2 Augustuses, 2 Augusti at the top, and 2 junior emperors under them, 2 Caesars under them. So you've basically got sort of 4 emperors with 2 senior ones and 2 junior ones. But then
each with their own like territory to watch over or something.
Right. Basically, the Roman Empire is split into 4 bits, essentially.
Right.
But then we've got, in the generation directly after that, is the age of Constantine, who spends
reconsolidates.
Spends basically most of his career, or nearly the first half of his career or more, reconsolidating it all under just his control. And of course, Constantine has gone down in history as famously, quite rightly, I suppose, as the first Christian emperor. But I don't know how much detail you know about his life and reign, but how that worked out, because he, I think it's fair to say that, well, he wasn't baptized until on his deathbed, but he did he did convert though, didn't he? Before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So still really on in like the very early 300s, like 305, 306, that sort of time. But he used it in a different way. It wasn't like a sort of a modern patriarch or a pope or a bishop or anything like that. He was still a very sort of secular man. He was still interested in secular power in the very real sense, in winning battles and destroying his enemies and all that sort of thing. So that's quite different to sort of our modern concept of Christianity, where it's, very forgiving and loving and being meek and mild and turning the other cheek and all that sort of thing. So I just wonder what you think about it. You must have some thoughts all about Constantine and how he's thought of in our age.
Okay, well, I want to make two completely different points.
Okay,
First,
please do.
recognize that he has got a personal influence. Remember, I said that there were Christians even in the household of the emperor. That is, the elites were being drawn into Christianity, into this new cult, which sociology teaches us that that's how it works.
Sorry, Stephen, is it too glib to say that it becomes fashionable? Is that too glib?
I think, this is a long period, so I think we couldn't say it's fashionable for 300 years, right?
Okay.
But yes, I think it falls in and out of being something that's fashionable. Okay. But whether it's considered fashionable at the moment, sort of in the air, in the zeitgeist, elites are quietly joining it throughout this period, right? Including in the house of the emperor. In particular, as you probably know, Helena, I think is the name, Constantine's mother, right? So Christianity now is not just in the household of the emperor, it's literally the emperor's mother. And I think that we can debate about how sort of strategic Constantine's conversion is. I don't know his heart. Maybe it was, I don't know. But you could see it as just being a political move, a cynical political move. Right. Let me come back to that. I don't think that's the right way to think. That's a modern way to think. Let me fix that in a sec. But I think everyone believes that Helena herself was just honestly a Christian, just sincerely a Christian. It wasn't a political calculation on her part. She was just a convert, and she influenced her son. Right. Okay, so yeah, now my second point, and we'll segue in terms of how cynical is Constantine's conversion. Okay, this is to make this division of thought and action that I think is not quite right, is sort of a modern thing. For Constantine, if Christianity is helpful to him politically and as emperor, then that is a testimony to its truth, I think. Right. So don't think of it as he has this personal religious experience and then he starts pushing Christianity as the emperor. Think of these things as a little more united. And the reason I say this is because that picture of Christianity is just peaceful and not having to do with battle and conquering. I think that is, again, it's kind of modern, and also it's focusing on the very, very early church. But there's another period of Christianity that we should have a better understanding of, which we're not going to get into this time, but maybe we could do another time. And that is the ongoing spread of Christianity throughout Europe over the next over 1,000 years after Constantine. Right. Because the last country to become Christian, last European country to become Christian, isn't until like 1400 or something. Right. So, yes, Christianity won in the Roman Empire, as we've described, but then Rome fell, or the Western Roman Empire fell, right? So what happened in Europe? Well, it's a complicated story. And there's a book, which I've got sitting on my shelves. I'm looking for an excuse to read it and talk about it with someone, called The Barbarian Conversions. Big, thick book that goes through that 1,000-year history. It really starts with where we're leaving off. That is early Christianity winning in the Roman Empire. It starts there and takes up the story of what happens to Christianity in Europe for the next 1,000 years. How is it that Spain becomes Christian and the Scandinavian countries become Christian.
Right.
It's that they're not all Christian in 400 AD. That's for darn sure.
Right, absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So there's a very complicated story, and you'd think we would know more about it because for those of us who are European, it's our story, right? It's our story of like the last 1500 years, and we don't really know it. I don't know it. I just have a big thick book that's going to tell me about it when I get around to it. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is that what I do know about that period is that you'd have a bit of what you see at the the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, right? Yeah. You have quite a bit of that sort of thing. Whereas we think of people becoming Christians as this sort of intellectual exercise or something, you have a lot in the conversion of Europe to Christianity of some war leader, Gallic war leader, Viking war leader saying, okay, God, I'm going to fight this battle, and if I win, then I'll become a Christian. I'll do this, in your name, and if I win, then okay, you got me, right? So there's a lot more of Christianity not spreading through military means exactly in the same way that, say, Islam does, where Islam becomes a conquering religious jihad, right? That doesn't exactly, I'm sure there's bits of that, but that's not really the story of Christianity spreading in Europe. But it is much more mixed up with battle and war and, Jesus helps me win fights.
Yeah.
Right. Which feels strange to us, but it is our history. And I wish we knew it better. So.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Exactly that sort of thing. I wonder if we could touch then, just perhaps briefly, what would have to be briefly, on Julian the Apostate. Not necessarily his reign, exactly what he did, but sort of the kickback to it. Because when you talk about we're talking about really vast swathes of time and history here. And again, just broadly speaking, anyone who doesn't know, Julian the Apostate was a Roman emperor in the, we're talking the 360s, who sort of kicked back and said, no, I'm explicitly not Christian. We're going to have a revitalize, we're going to reboot sort of classical Roman paganism, and we're going to have a bit of a pretty serious persecution of the Christians. But the arc of that is that after him, Christianity flourished once and for all, if you like.
Yeah. That was the last attempt.
Yeah.
Of paganism to reassert itself, right?
Yeah.
So this is 50 years after the Edict of Milan, right? That's 313. This is 361 to 363 for Julian, right? So it's really kind of insane in a way, because what he's trying to do is a sect move. Right? He's trying to be like, we're going to get fundamentalist about paganism, right? We're going to return to the old gods, which probably made a lot of sense in the 2nd century or something. Okay, but as I said, by like 350, it's estimated that most of the Roman Empire were Christians.
Right.
So this is a sect move, that is as if paganism is the established religion, the predominant religion, when it's not the predominant religion anymore.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like, okay, paganism has become a minority. Pagans are a minority in the empire at this point, or they're darn close to it if they're not a minority. And we're gonna like revitalize paganism as if it's sort of like a cult, a rebooted cult or something. I mean, from a sociology of religion point of view, it's just kind of bonkers. And it was absolutely doomed. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, Christianity was predominant at this point, and paganism didn't really have anything fresh to offer. I mean, really, all he was doing, as far as I can tell now, maybe you know it better, what he was sort of, what the deal he was offering, you could say, was. But I think all he had to offer was just force.
Right. Yeah.
And that isn't enough. Now, force plays a big factor in politics, right? But when we talk about like Moscow's political formula, it's not enough. You can't dominate strictly through force, because in the end, as we libertarians love to point out, the people who are ruling are always a minority. They have to be, right? Because they're living off the productive people, the rest of us, right? So you've always got a minority ruling over the majority. And most of the time that's fine, because we all sort of agree that, you have divine right to rule, or whatever the political formula of democracy has allowed Biden to be president somehow, right. So somehow we agree that it's okay for you to be in charge, right? But when the minority just completely goes after the majority, and the majority is not in agreement with it, well, now they're just a minority that's pushing you around. Well, how long is that going to last?
Yeah.
The majority is not going to put up with it.
Yeah, you're right. It's like doomed.
Let's say if you did. Let us imagine that you didn't think Biden was the legitimate president, and then he just started targeting the majority of the population for persecution, and the population didn't even think he was a legitimate president. You've got a very scary situation there, a very volatile situation, I should say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think you're quite right. Julian was sort of too late. I think perhaps Christianity already had far too much momentum by that point.
Right.
I think that's fair to say. I mean, if we skip ahead,
and he had nothing to offer, right? You're talking about sort of the meaning, right? What was he offering in terms of filling in that lack of meaning that we were talking about in the Roman Empire among the pagans? Did he have some new spin on paganism that made it give us answers that it wasn't giving before? I don't think so. I think he just had force. Yeah. That's not enough.
Yeah, I think perhaps historians that know Julian inside out might disagree, but I think it's just a type of sort of ultra conservatism with a small c. It's just looking back at the old days, and without any sort of deep analysis, just isn't that better? I mean, he died in battle. Some say may even have been murdered. So it doesn't seem like it was a popular move, particularly, to persecute lots and lots of Christians by that point. I mean, by the age, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but Theodosius the First, and we're now talking sort of the 390s, codifies a fair few things and sort of stamps it sort of deep into the heart of all Roman bureaucracy and things by that stage. I mean, you've already got the break with the East and the West by the 390s. You've got Constantinople, of course, established in the East, in the eastern half of the Roman Empire by that point. But when you get the fall of the Roman Empire, or rather the fall of let's say the Western Roman Empire, dealt some serious blows around 410, but by the 470s, the secular military might of at least the Western Roman Empire has collapsed. Mm-hmm. And someone like Edward Gibbon, I don't know if you've got feelings on Edward Gibbon, but Edward Gibbon sort of largely blames that in all sorts of ways on the church, the Catholic Church. But yet also we see, don't we, that the church steps in and takes the place of Rome in all sorts of ways, and sort of keeps kind of, again, this is sort of quite glib, but keeps civilization alive. It's through the church, it's through Christianity when Rome itself collapses. And well, don't you think that it's therefore not all that surprising that over the next 1,000 years or so, Christianity is got firm foundations. There are no other foundations left. Right.
Yeah, I think Gibbon should have read some Spengler. Unfortunately, Spengler was hundreds of years after him. Right. Because it seems to me that what happens with the collapse of the Western Empire is just the civilizational cycle, and I think it's sort of silly to blame it on Christianity. As you said, with the crisis of the 3rd century, right? There's big problems structurally with the Roman Empire, right? And the Christians didn't create the crisis of the 3rd century, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I just think he just had it out for Christianity. I have read Gibbon. He had it out for Christianity, I think, and with the Spenglerian view and with other things that we know now, I don't know if anyone's done it, but I bet you could do a pretty thorough demolition of his criticism, his blaming of the church for the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. I just don't think it adds up, personally. Yeah. And I'm not saying that as like a Christian partisan. I just don't think it's a good explanation.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah, no, I mean, Gibbon, it's one of the elements, but he does put a fair amount of emphasis on it, doesn't he? I mean, but there's obviously more going on than that. But I find it fascinating when most historians, nearly all historians, seem to agree that when there were sort of periods of anarchy in the 5th, 6th, 7th century, something approaching anarchy across, again, at least Western Europe, and that it was the church that sort of kept the flicker of light. Well, the art historian Kenneth Clark said we survived by the skin of our teeth. And that's largely thanks to the church, that right. Western culture, Western civilization could have utterly imploded, and it was Christianity that prevented that. Do you think that's fair to say, or in your opinion?
Yeah, there's what is it? How Ireland saved civilization or something? How the Irish saved civilization. You ever heard of that one?
And the small, tiny enclaves of Western Christianity that survived out in the.
Here we go. Islands. Here's a book for you. Thomas Cahill, Cahill. How the Irish saved civilization: The Untold Story of Ireland's Heroic Role from the Fall of Rome to the Rise of Medieval Europe. Basically, Ireland, right, which is really distant from a lot of the turmoil here. These Irish monasteries, they keep the books alive. Right. You know, they're copying the books. Yeah. And so the reason he says how they save civilization, to some degree, he's talking about the books. They kept the classics of pagan literature and Christian literature literally physically alive when there was just chaos going on the continent through that period. So anyway, there's a whole nother story to be told of the post collapse. And how do we end up several hundred years later with the Middle Ages, which I think are really glorious, as I've talked about on my channel.
Yeah, I mentioned Lindisfarne there. I think I actually meant like Skellig St. Michael. Anyway, it's very, very tiny places, way out in the sort of the Atlantic Ocean almost, that sort of kept the Irish church alive, which then people like Bede, the Venerable Bede, tell us it never died. It was never completely snuffed out. And so when you get to sort of the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century, it's then in conflict with a sort of a rejuvenated Roman see, and they come into conflict with each other. That's a fascinating thing. Well, one last thing, unfortunately our time is getting towards an end because we have to get ready for the afternoon podcast, but I would like to ask you just briefly a little bit about, or what your feelings are on sort of, once again, broadly speaking, but with heresies and schisms and things, because of course the Christian church, at least in the West, it's not sort of completely uniform over the centuries. There have been, even earlier on, there's the Arian heresies, or the Donatists from North Africa, or even the Great Schism of the 11th century. But these are sort of profound rips in the church, in theology anyway. And yet it seems to have survived all of those. Even, you mentioned Henry VIII, even sort of the Anglican break with Rome. And yet it seems there's no way to, it was never a death knell to it. And doesn't that speak of sort of a deep, quite a firm foundation of, spirituality, for want of a better expression? What do you think?
I mean, this is where me being a Protestant comes into play. I'm not a Catholic or an Orthodox, where they are very focused on that particular line of Christianity, right? And anything else is sort of a failure and a distraction and so forth, Whereas I have a sort of a broader view of the history of Christianity, like you're talking about here, and that Christianity adapts to a lot of different cultural situations, right? A lot of different historical situations. But the fundamental focus on Jesus, because it is, in the end, it's just the cult of Jesus, you might say, right? The fundamental focus on Jesus is there in Roman Catholicism, in Eastern Orthodoxy, in Anglicanism, in the lowest forms of Protestantism, like the one I come from. All of us can, what's the creed? The Nicene Creed? Almost all theologically conservative Christians, that is, people who haven't sort of gotten into the secularism of this age and, liberal Christianity or whatever, but all the ones who sort of consider themselves really, they're Bible-believing Christians, we could all say the Nicene Creed together, and we would be completely comfortable with that.
Right.
That's amazing.
That's powerful, isn't it?
That's 1700 years ago. And I'm claiming that right now you could go all over the world, gather Christians from all different cultures, all different high church, low church, etc., and we could all stand there and say the Nicene Creed together. So I think there's a little too much emphasis in analyzing Christianity on organizational unity.
Right.
And it helps to step back from the various splits and organizational splits and Henry VIII and all that stuff. Step back from that and notice how much Christians are in agreement through all this time and even still, right? And so I find that in practice, I have friends who are Orthodox and friends who are Catholic, and in practice, we treat each other as brothers spiritually.
That's a lovely note to end it on, actually. We could talk more about the wars of religion in the 15th, 16th century, but that's a very nice note to leave it on. Well, Stephen, Radical Liberation, I'm very grateful for your time. Really appreciate it. It's been a great talk. I'd like to get you back on again and we can deep dive into something else or keep going on that conversation. I could do another hour easily. Got lots more notes that I'd like to ask you about, but we shall have to leave it there, unfortunately. But once again, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.